Today I'm going to be showing you how to make Simplicity 8606 View C. I made a size 22, which calls for a 37-inch waist. Mine is 39 inches right now, and it still fits great. For supplies, you'll need 2 yards of lightweight fabric, 1.5 yards of lightweight interfacing, 1 spool of thread, sewing machine, and scissors. Before we begin, I just want to show you what it looks like. I'm going to be using this skirt for my ballet class. It makes a great little ballet skirt. If you are lucky enough to have a teacher that lets you wear a skirt, this is a really fun option for a ballet skirt. Pretty easy thing to sew together, and I highly recommend it. It also makes a really great summer skirt. I do recommend wearing some little stretchy shorts underneath it because it's very short. I love how the skirt turned out. Stick around, I'll walk you through the process of how I put it together, and then you can pick up the pattern and make it yourself. First thing you need to do is wash and dry your fabric. While you're waiting for your fabric to be ready, it's a good time to look over the directions and to cut out your pattern pieces. Today we're making View C, and it uses pieces 1 through 5. I'm using fabric from my stash, and I don't have enough of it to make the waist and tie pieces. You should follow the directions on pattern piece placement. I'm using a black cotton solid, and I'll show you that in just a moment for the waistband and the ties. I'm going to be using this pattern again, so instead of cutting the tissue paper, I'm folding it along the lines. This way I can unfold them when I'm done, and I can make the other skirts in the pattern. Now, for some reason, this pattern has you cut 2 pieces for the back of the skirt. I decided to cut it out on the fold of the fabric and just have 1 solid piece for the back instead of 2 smaller pieces with a seam down the center. Once I have my pattern pieces placed onto my fabric where I want them, I use rocks to weigh my pattern down. Then I'm going to cut out my pieces with a rotary cutter. If you don't have a rotary cutter, you're going to want to pin them down and use some scissors to cut your pieces out. Now that my pieces are cut out, I pin them onto my dress form to see what it will look like. And so far, I think it's pretty cute. Now I take my black fabric and I cut out 3 pieces needed for the waist and the ties. And then I cut out the interfacing for the waist. I didn't have a long enough piece of interfacing, so I just cut out a small piece and tacked it onto the end. Once the skirt is finished, no one will ever know. Step 1 is to stay stitch the upper edge of the front sections. The stay stitching stays in place, meaning you don't have to rip it out. So here I'm showing where I'll be stay stitching my pieces. Remember that if you're following the directions exactly, you will have 4 pieces instead of 3. To stay stitch the ends, I set my length to 4. This will make a large stitch that is easy to rip out if I need to. Then I go ahead and use that stitch to sew along the top edge. You do this to give the fabric a little more stability so it doesn't stretch. Step 2. In the directions, it calls for you to sew the 2 back pieces together. Because I cut my back piece on the fold of the fabric, I'm skipping that step. But if you're following the directions for this piece, you will have to stitch the 2 back pieces together down the center seam. But for me, step 2 is to sew the front pieces to the back piece at the side seams. Here I've pinned my side seams together, and I used my overlock machine or my serger to sew them together. Then I iron the seams open on the inside, and I iron it on the outside of the fabric as well. Once that is done, I set the stitch length on my sewing machine back to 1. And I use my sewing machine to lock the ends in place by using a straight stitch to sew over the ends. This way I can clip the loose strings and not worry about the serged ends unraveling. If you don't have a serger, then just use a straight basic stitch to sew the 2 pieces together. The edges will be raw, but I don't believe that's too big of a deal. It should still hold up with most fabric types. Step 3 says to machine baste the lower edges of the skirt. Press up the hem and tuck under the raw edges to meet the basting. Press and stitch the hem into place and then remove the basting. I'm skipping the basting. Yes, it gives you a nice line to follow while you're trying to make sure that your hem is even. However, I'm lazy and I don't want to get my seam ripper out, so I carefully took my time when I folded the hem and I was ironing it down. Then I stitched the folded hem down. Steps 4 to 7, you apply the fusible interfacing and you press under the very top edge of the waistband, attach the skirt, and then prep the right and the left waist ties. So here I'm ironing the fusible interfacing onto what will be the inside of the waistband. You'll see here how I have to patch it together to make it long enough. Now I'm folding down the top edge of the waistband and ironing it down. With the right sides together, I pin the skirt onto the waistband. I always start in the middle, this way if there's excess or too little fabric, it'll be the same on both sides. I figured that there'd be a little extra, like maybe 2 inches or so, because I cut the back piece out on the fold of the fabric. However, I had 3 inches extra on both sides, which leads me to believe that even if I would have followed the directions exactly, the skirt and the waistband wouldn't meet up properly. So I recommend adding extra inches to the waistband. You can always trim them down. So here I just folded over the excess skirt and it's fine. I don't mind it. However, next time I'll be prepared to make the waistband longer. Now it's time to sew the skirt and the waistband together. Once that's done, you'll want to press the seam up towards the top of the waistband. And I trimmed the fabric and then I also pressed it on the outside. The next step, you take your tie and you fold it in half. I'm sorry I don't have video of me doing that. But then you sew it along the short side and then you turn your fabric and you sew down the length of it, leaving one end open. And you clip off the corners. And then you can turn it inside out. My mom gave me this tool that makes it really easy to do this. I'm not sure what it's called, but these ties are so thick that it's really easy to do it without this little tool. But yeah, you turn it the right side out and then you pick the corners of the end of the tie and iron it. And then you're going to repeat these steps for the other tie. Then you need to pin the ties to the outer skirt. So put it on the right side of the skirt, making sure that it's even with the waistband, and sew them in place. In steps 9 through 11, you'll finish the skirt. First, you'll fold the right sides of the waistband together and pin them in place. Then sew the ends together. And trim off the excess. And now you can turn the waistband right side out. It's really easy. You really just have to pull the tie straps and it will flip itself right side out. And then you iron the waistband down, making sure that the inside fold is a little bit longer than the outside. And that'll make sense in just a second. Pin it in place. This way you can sew along the outside ditch where the waistband and the skirt meet. It will catch the waistband and sew it to the skirt. You want to double check that the band was sewn down in the back. You may need to go over it in a couple places. I was lucky this time around, but it would have been really easy and not uncommon to have to go back over and hand sew a couple places if the machine didn't catch it. I used chalk to mark the inside where I want the buttonhole to go. And then I set up my machine and use a scrap piece of fabric to practice before sewing the buttonhole onto the waistband. Here I'm sewing the buttonhole onto the skirt. And then I use my little snippers to cut the buttonhole, and the skirt is done. Step 12 just tells you how to put the dress on. So here I'm putting it on my dress form and it's done and I love it. It's so cute.